Her husband divorced her for his mistress, not knowing she inherited a $30 billion empire. Then, a billionaire forgot his wallet, and the cashier shocked the entire store. The divorce papers hit the marble countertop with a sound that shattered more than just silence. Her husband stood there with his mistress clinging to his arm, both of them wearing matching smiles that reeked of triumph. But what they didn't know would soon rewrite every assumption they'd ever made about the woman they were discarding. The mistress, a woman who'd spent 18 months stealing another woman's life, laughed as she examined the modest apartment they were forcing her to accept in the settlement, but the inheritance letter sitting unopened in her purse would soon reveal a $30 billion empire that had been waiting for the right moment to place unimaginable power into her trembling hands. 3 weeks later, she stood in an ordinary grocery store, her designer clothes replaced with simple jeans and a sweater, watching as a billionaire in an expensive suit reached for his wallet at the checkout counter, only to discover it wasn't there. But what happened next would shock every single person in that store and set in motion a chain of events that would destroy her ex-husband's entire world. The cashier's hands froze mid-scan as the card reader processed her payment, but the numbers that flashed across the screen belonged to a tier of wealth that most people only heard about in whispers, and suddenly, everyone in that store realized they were standing in the presence of someone who'd been hiding in plain sight. Would her husband discover the truth before he lost everything, but more importantly, would the mysterious billionaire who'd forgotten his wallet prove to be the ally she never knew she needed? Or was there something deeper happening in that grocery store encounter that would change both of their lives forever? Dear viewers, you're about to witness a powerful story about hidden worth, strategic patience, and the devastating cost of judging people by their circumstances rather than their character. This narrative will teach you that true power doesn't announce itself with noise, but reveals itself through dignity. That the people you underestimate today might be the ones who define your tomorrow, and that revenge served with grace is far more devastating than revenge served with anger. You'll learn the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances, understanding that every person carries hidden depths you know nothing about, and recognizing that the greatest victories come not from humiliating others, but from becoming so undeniably successful that your former doubters become irrelevant to your journey. After watching, drop in the comments what lessons you took from this story and what you would have done differently if you were in her shoes during those first painful days after the divorce. Subscribe for more stories that entertain, inspire, and remind you that your current chapter is never your final destination. Rebecca had chosen the marble countertop herself 3 years ago, back when she believed her opinions still mattered in the house she'd helped buy. Now that same surface became the stage for her humiliation as David slid the divorce papers across it with the casual indifference of someone discarding junk mail, but the tremor in her hands as she reached for them betrayed every emotion she was desperately trying to hide. His mistress, Vanessa, a marketing executive with predatory eyes and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, stood so close to David that their bodies formed a united front. But Rebecca noticed the way Vanessa's fingers dug possessively into his sleeve, revealing an insecurity that no amount of designer perfume could mask. "I think you'll find the settlement more than fair," David said, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured patience he used when he wanted to appear magnanimous. But Rebecca had learned over 7 years of marriage that his generosity always came with invisible strings attached. "The apartment on Riverside is modest, I'll admit, but it's more than adequate for someone starting over at your level." Vanessa's laugh cut through the room like a blade. "David's being too kind, honestly," she said, examining her manicured nails with theatrical disinterest, but her eyes never left Rebecca's face, feeding on every micro-expression of pain. Most men would have left you with far less, especially considering you brought nothing to the marriage but that tragic little teaching salary. The words landed exactly where Vanessa intended them to, but Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking, but hardening, crystallizing into something sharp and unbreakable. She thought about the envelope in her purse, the one that had arrived yesterday with a law firm's return address she didn't recognize, but she'd been too emotionally exhausted to open it. She thought about her grandmother, the woman her parents had forbidden her from seeing after some family dispute Rebecca had never fully understood, but who had sent birthday cards every year until her death 3 months ago. "I'll sign them," Rebecca heard herself say, her voice steadier than she expected, but she watched David's eyebrows rise slightly as if he'd anticipated more resistance, more begging. "On one condition." David exchanged a glance with Vanessa, their shared smirk revealing exactly how little they thought Rebecca had to bargain with, but he gestured magnanimously. "Name it. I want everything out of this house by Friday," Rebecca said, each word deliberate and clear, but she saw confusion flicker across Vanessa's face. "Every single item I brought into this marriage, my books, my grandmother's tea set, my winter coats, everything, and I never want to see either of you again after I walk out that door." Vanessa actually laughed at that. "Honey, we were planning to redecorate anyway," she said, already mentally rearranging furniture that wasn't yet legally hers, but her eagerness revealed how thoroughly she'd already moved into Rebecca's life. "Your taste was always so bargain basement." Rebecca signed each page without reading them, her signature flowing with a steadiness that surprised her, but she felt David watching her with something that might have been curiosity or might have been suspicion. When she reached the final page, she paused, pen hovering over the line, and allowed herself one last look at the man she'd loved enough to shrink herself for. But all she saw was a stranger wearing her husband's face. "One more thing," she said quietly, capping the pen with a soft click that somehow felt louder than Vanessa's voice had been, but she met David's eyes with something he'd never seen there before. "When you look back on this moment, someday, I want you to remember that you made this choice. Not me. You." David's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed facade, but Vanessa's hand on his arm pulled him back from whatever response he'd been forming. "We'll remember that you were gracious in defeat," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, but Rebecca noticed how tightly she was gripping David's sleeve, as if afraid he might reconsider. Rebecca gathered the papers, slid them into her bag next to the unopened envelope that would change everything, and walked toward the door with her spine straight and her head high, but she heard Vanessa whisper something to David that ended with, "Finally free." The words followed her into the hallway, down the stairs, and into the parking garage where her modest sedan waited, but they couldn't follow her into the future that was waiting in that envelope, a future that would make this moment of humiliation look like the best thing that ever happened to her. She sat in her car for 10 minutes before her hands stopped shaking enough to drive, but when she finally pulled the envelope from her purse and broke the seal, the words "sole beneficiary" and $30 billion estate blurred through tears that were no longer about loss. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and new money, a combination that made Rebecca's head spin as she sat across from Thomas Whitmore, a man whose silver hair and impeccable suit suggested he'd never had a modest day in his life, but his eyes held a warmth that contradicted the corporate fortress surrounding them. He'd been explaining her grandmother's empire for 20 minutes, using terms like international holdings and diversified portfolio, but Rebecca kept circling back to the one number that seemed to rewrite reality itself. 30 billion, she said for the third time, her voice barely above a whisper, but Thomas nodded with the patience of someone who'd witnessed this particular shock before. "My grandmother, the woman my parents said was unstable, the woman they forbade me from seeing, built a $30 billion empire? Eleanor Ashford didn't just build it, Mrs. Harrison, Thomas corrected gently, then caught himself. My apologies. Miss Coleman now, I suppose, but your grandmother revolutionized telecommunications infrastructure across 4 continents. He slid a leather portfolio across his mahogany desk, but Rebecca's hands trembled too much to open it immediately. She wanted you kept separate from this world until you were old enough to handle it with wisdom rather than recklessness. The trust stipulated that you'd inherit everything on your 30th birthday or upon her death, whichever came first. Rebecca thought about her 30th birthday just 6 months away and wondered if her grandmother had somehow known that timing would matter, but the universe had accelerated the schedule through death instead. Why didn't she ever tell me? Why let me think she was just ordinary? Thomas's expression softened with something that looked like old grief. She tried to contact you multiple times over the years, but your parents blocked every attempt. But Eleanor believed that if you were meant to find your way to her, you would. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. She also believed that struggle builds character in ways that inherited wealth never could. She wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had. The irony struck Rebecca with physical force. She'd just signed away claim to a house worth maybe $2 million, while sitting on an inheritance that could buy 1,000 such houses without denting the interest. But she felt oddly grateful for the timing. If she'd known about this money during the divorce, David would have fought for every penny. But now the papers were signed, witnessed, and legally binding. I don't want anyone to know yet, Rebecca said suddenly, surprised by the certainty in her own voice, but Thomas raised an eyebrow with something that might have been approval. Is that possible? Can I keep this quiet while I figure out everything? Not only possible, but advisable, Thomas replied, pulling out a different folder that seemed to have been prepared for exactly this request, but Rebecca noticed he'd labeled it with her grandmother's handwriting. For Rebecca, the quiet path. Your grandmother anticipated you might want time to adjust. She's arranged for you to access funds through a private account that won't raise flags, but the corporate holdings, the board positions, the public face of the Ashford Empire, those can wait until you're ready. Rebecca opened the portfolio with shaking fingers and found herself staring at photographs of buildings she'd walked past 1,000 times without knowing they belonged to her family, but each image came with detailed annotations in her grandmother's precise handwriting. There were notes about corrupt board members to replace, charitable foundations to establish, and family members who'd tried to contest the will. But one sentence, underlined 3 times, made Rebecca's throat tighten. Watch people when they think you have nothing. That's when you see their real faces. She knew, Rebecca whispered, thinking about David's dismissive tone and Vanessa's cruel laughter. But Thomas's expression suggested he understood exactly what she meant. Somehow, she knew I'd need to see who people really were. Eleanor had a gift for reading situations, Thomas said carefully. But Rebecca caught the implication that her grandmother might have been watching from afar, orchestrating this revelation for maximum impact. She also left you this. He produced a small envelope, unsealed, containing a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. Rebecca's vision blurred as she read her grandmother's final words. Dear Rebecca, if you're reading this, you've just discovered that the people who made you feel small were only revealing their own limitations, not yours. But I hope you'll use this gift not for revenge, but for becoming so magnificent that their opinions become irrelevant. The world will try to tell you what a woman with power should look like. Ignore them and become what you were always meant to be. Love, even beyond death, Grandmother Eleanor. Rebecca folded the note carefully, placed it in her wallet next to her new black card, the kind that only 50 people in the world carried, and made a decision that would change everything. but she needed to know who would treat her with dignity when they thought she was nobody. "I want to live quietly for a few weeks," she told Thomas, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Keep the apartment David gave me. Keep shopping at normal stores. See who people really are." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Rebecca saw why her grandmother had trusted this man with everything. "Eleanor said you'd say something exactly like that, but be careful. The world has a way of revealing truths when you least expect it." 3 days later, Rebecca would discover just how right he was, standing in a grocery store checkout line behind a billionaire with a missing wallet. But in that moment, sitting in her grandmother's lawyer's office, she simply felt the weight of possibilities settling onto her shoulders like a crown she was finally ready to wear. The fluorescent lights of Morrison's Market hummed with their usual Tuesday afternoon indifference, casting everything in that particular shade of reality that made luxury feel like a distant fantasy. But Rebecca had chosen this store specifically because nobody here knew her as anything other than the quiet woman who bought sensible groceries and always remembered to bring her own bags. She'd been coming here for 3 weeks since the inheritance revelation, living in her modest riverside apartment and watching how the world treated her when they thought she was ordinary. But today, the universe had apparently decided her education in human nature needed an unexpected lesson. The man in front of her wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that whispered rather than shouted wealth. But what caught Rebecca's attention wasn't his clothes. She'd watched him for the past 15 minutes as she'd navigated the produce section and dairy aisle, not out of attraction, but out of fascination with how he moved through the world. But every interaction told her something important about his character. He'd helped an elderly woman reach a can of soup on the top shelf, crouching down afterward to ask if she needed anything else. But his tone held genuine interest rather than performative kindness. When a harried mother with twin toddlers had accidentally bumped into him with her overflowing cart, he'd steadied a falling juice bottle and insisted she go ahead of him in line. But Rebecca noticed he'd slipped a $20 bill into the woman's diaper bag when she wasn't looking. He'd treated the teenage stock clerk restocking cereal with the same respect most people reserved for corporate executives, but it was the casual ease of it that intrigued Rebecca. This wasn't someone performing goodness for an audience. Now he stood at the checkout counter, items scanned and bagged, reaching into his jacket pocket with the automatic confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about forgotten wallets, but his hand emerged empty. He tried the other pocket, then his pants, then back to the jacket, and Rebecca watched the exact moment realization hit his face. Not panic, interestingly, but a kind of bemused frustration that suggested this was inconvenient, but not catastrophic. "I apologize," he said to the cashier, a middle-aged woman named Diane, whose name tag had been crooked for the entire 3 weeks Rebecca had been shopping here, but his voice carried genuine regret rather than entitled irritation. "I seem to have left my wallet in my other jacket. I can have someone bring it, or I can simply come back." "Sir, there are people waiting," Diane said, her voice sharp with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd heard every excuse invented, but she gestured to the growing line behind him with barely concealed impatience. "I can't hold up the line for—" "I'll cover it," Rebecca heard herself say, stepping forward before her brain could engage with the implications, but she felt something shift in the air as both the man and Diane turned to look at her. She pulled out her wallet, extracting the black card Thomas had given her with specific instructions. "Use this one for daily purchases. It won't raise flags, but it will give you access to whatever you need." What Thomas hadn't mentioned, but what Rebecca was about to discover, was that "won't raise flags" was relative depending on who was looking, but Diane had been working retail long enough to recognize certain things that didn't belong in a neighborhood grocery store. The man studied Rebecca with sudden intensity, his dark eyes taking in her simple jeans and sweater, her lack of jewelry, her canvas shopping bag, but something in his expression suggested he was seeing beyond the surface in a way most people never bothered to. "That's very kind," he said carefully. And Rebecca noticed he didn't immediately accept, testing whether her offer was genuine or performative. "But I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," Rebecca interrupted gently, handing her card to Diane, but she kept her eyes on the man's face, watching him process this unexpected kindness. "You were going to solve it yourself. I'm just offering a faster solution." Diane swiped the card, and for a moment, nothing happened. Just the normal pause of electronic processing that nobody thinks twice about, but then the register made a sound Rebecca had never heard before, a soft chime that seemed to trigger something in Diane's expression. The cashier's eyes dropped to the card reader display, then widened in a way that would have been comical if it wasn't about to shatter Rebecca's carefully maintained anonymity, but Rebecca watched the numbers reflected in Diane's pupils and knew exactly what she was seeing. "Ma'am," Diane breathed, her voice suddenly stripped of all customer service automation, but her hands trembled as she processed the transaction. "This card, I need to call my manager." "No, wait." She looked up at Rebecca with something approaching awe, but her voice carried through the suddenly quiet store. "You're Rebecca Coleman. You're Eleanor Ashford's granddaughter." "Oh my God, everyone, do you know who this is?" The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but Rebecca felt those seconds stretch like taffy as every person in the checkout area turned to stare, but it was the man whose wallet had gone missing who responded first. His expression shifted through surprise to understanding to something that looked almost like satisfaction. And when he extended his hand formally, Rebecca noticed he wasn't thrown by the revelation the way most people would be. "Nathaniel Pierce," he said, his handshake firm but not aggressive, but his eyes held questions that Rebecca knew would eventually demand answers. "And I think my wallet didn't forget itself. I think it knew exactly what it was doing." Rebecca's phone buzzed in her pocket. Thomas, probably, alerted by some security system that her cover had just been blown, but she ignored it, instead meeting Nathaniel's gaze with newfound clarity. "Then I suppose we should talk about why a billionaire would deliberately engineer a situation to test a stranger's character," she said quietly, but her voice carried enough steel to let him know she wasn't someone who could be manipulated, even by someone as intriguing as he was proving to be. Diane was still staring, her finger hovering over what was probably a social media app, and Rebecca could see other shoppers pulling out their phones, but the moment had already crossed the point of no return. The quiet phase of her inheritance was officially over, and somewhere across town, David was about to receive news that would destroy everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd thrown away. But standing in Morrison's Market with a billionaire who'd forgotten his wallet and a store full of witnesses, Rebecca felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Not fear of exposure, but relief that she could finally stop pretending to be less than she was. "Your total was $47. Rebecca said to Nathaniel, a smile tugging at her lips despite everything, but she let him see the challenge in her eyes. "Should I add interest for the emotional manipulation?" Nathaniel's laugh was genuine and surprised, cutting through the tension like sunlight through clouds. But when he answered, his voice carried a respect that David had never managed in 7 years of marriage. "I think I'm going to be paying interest on this for quite some time, but something tells me it'll be worth every penny." The Montgomery Grand Hotel Ballroom had hosted 1,000 charity galas over its 70-year history, each one a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and influence. But tonight's healthcare initiative fundraiser would be remembered for reasons that had nothing to do with the cause. Rebecca stood near the entrance in a midnight blue gown that her grandmother's stylist had selected, elegant without being ostentatious, powerful without screaming for attention, but she felt the weight of every eye in the room, tracking her movement like a predator assessing new territory. The grocery store incident had gone viral within 6 hours, with Diane's shaky phone video accumulating 3 million views before Rebecca had even made it home that afternoon. But the internet had done what the internet does best, turned a simple act of kindness into a mythology that bore only passing resemblance to reality. Still, the revelation had served its purpose. Now everyone knew that the divorced nobody was actually one of the wealthiest women in the country, and the invitations had started arriving before sunset. "You came," Nathaniel said, materializing at her elbow with 2 champagne flutes, but his presence felt less like an intrusion and more like the continuation of a conversation they'd been having in increments since the store. "I wasn't sure you would, given that I essentially ambushed you into the public eye." Rebecca accepted the champagne, meeting his gaze with the directness she'd been practicing in mirrors for 3 weeks, but she saw something in his expression that told her he'd been just as surprised by the viral explosion as she had. "Your wallet really was missing, wasn't it?" she said, the question emerging before she could stop it. "You didn't plan the phones, the video, the attention. My wallet was exactly where I left it. In my other jacket, just as I said," Nathaniel replied, but his smile carried an admission that made Rebecca's estimation of him shift slightly. "But I'd noticed you in the store, watched you watch people, saw you help that teenager find the organic section without making him feel stupid. I wanted to know what you'd do when tested, but I never imagined someone would recognize that card." He paused, weighing his words. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry the choice was taken from you about when to reveal yourself." Rebecca was about to respond when the room's energy shifted with the particular electricity that accompanies the arrival of someone significant, but the significance in this case was personal rather than professional. David entered with Vanessa on his arm, both of them dressed like they were attending a coronation rather than a charity event. But Rebecca noticed immediately that something had changed in how they carried themselves. There was a brittleness to their smiles, a desperation in how tightly they clung to each other. Vanessa saw Rebecca first, her champagne flute freezing halfway to her lips, but the color that drained from her face told Rebecca that the viral video had already done its damage to whatever fantasy Vanessa had been constructing. David followed his fiancée's gaze, and Rebecca watched 17 different emotions cross his face in the span of 3 seconds: disbelief, recognition, calculation, rage, and finally a kind of nauseating hope that made her stomach turn. "Rebecca," David said, crossing the ballroom with the purposeful stride of someone who believed he still had the right to her attention, but Nathaniel shifted almost imperceptibly, positioning himself not protectively, but supportively beside her. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 days, but your number's been disconnected." "I changed it," Rebecca said simply, her voice carrying none of the emotion David was clearly expecting, but she noticed Vanessa hanging back, for once allowing David to lead rather than pulling his strings. "Was there something specific you needed?" The question landed like a slap, polite, distant, completely devoid of the warmth or anger that would have suggested she still cared enough to hate him, but David's jaw tightened in a way Rebecca recognized from 1,000 old arguments. "I need to talk to you privately," he said, lowering his voice as if intimacy could rebuild what he'd demolished. "About the settlement. Obviously, things have changed, and we should discuss—" "The settlement is finalized and legally binding," Rebecca interrupted, but she kept her tone conversational, aware that dozens of phones were probably recording this interaction. "You received exactly what you asked for, David. I signed papers giving you the house, the car, and freedom from our marriage. What more could you possibly want?" "You know exactly what," Vanessa snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking, but her voice carried through the ballroom with a shrillness that made nearby conversations pause. You deliberately hid your wealth during the divorce? That's fraud. We could sue you for what? Nathaniel's voice was quiet but carried the kind of authority that comes from actual power rather than performed confidence. And Rebecca noticed how the room had gone silent, everyone abandoning pretense to watch this confrontation unfold. For not disclosing an inheritance she hadn't yet received? The timeline is a matter of public record. Eleanor Ashford's will wasn't probated until 4 days after the divorce was finalized. There's no legal ground here, just embarrassment that you didn't bother to investigate who you were discarding. David's face flushed with rage and humiliation, but Rebecca saw the exact moment he pivoted from legal threats to personal appeals, his expression softening into something that might have worked on the woman she used to be. "Becca, we were together for 7 years," he said, using the nickname he knew she'd once loved, but it sounded hollow now, manipulative. "That has to mean something. I made a mistake. Vanessa was a mistake, but we can fix this. We were good together once." "We were never good together, David," Rebecca said, and the clarity in her voice seemed to physically push him back a step, but she felt Nathaniel's presence beside her like an anchor. "I made myself smaller so you could feel bigger. I silenced my opinions so you could feel smarter. I dimmed my light so you wouldn't feel threatened by my shine, but you still chose to leave me for someone who made you feel important." She paused, letting the truth settle over the silent ballroom. "The inheritance didn't change who I am. It just revealed who you always were." Vanessa grabbed David's arm, trying to pull him away from the conversation that was rapidly becoming a public execution of their credibility, but David jerked free with a violence that made several people gasp. "You think you're better than me now?" he snarled, all pretense of reconciliation evaporating. "You think money makes you special? You're still the same boring, plain woman I outgrew, but now you're wearing an expensive dress." "Actually," said a voice from behind them, and Rebecca turned to see Thomas Whitmore approaching with a folder that made David's face go white. "She's the woman who now owns 42% of Harrison Digital Solutions, the company where you work, David." Thomas opened the folder with theatrical precision. Eleanor Ashford acquired the shares through a subsidiary 3 years ago as part of a telecommunications infrastructure investment, but the board has just voted unanimously to accept Rebecca's recommendation for new executive leadership. He smiled without warmth. "Your termination is effective immediately, along with the revocation of all stock options and performance bonuses. You'll receive severance as outlined in your contract, nothing more." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Vanessa's champagne flute shattering against the marble floor. But Rebecca felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a profound sense of completion. She'd spent 3 weeks learning that revenge wasn't about destruction, but about becoming so successful that the opinions of small people became irrelevant. And watching David's world crumble felt less like victory and more like the inevitable consequence of his own choices. "I didn't do this for revenge," Rebecca said quietly, addressing David but speaking to the room that would spread this story far beyond these walls. "I did this because the board needed leadership that valued people over profit margins, innovation over ego, and integrity over appearance. You failed on all 3 counts long before you failed as my husband." She turned to leave, Nathaniel falling into step beside her with the ease of someone who understood when words had accomplished their purpose. But David's voice followed them across the ballroom one final time. "You'll regret this," he called out, desperation making him reckless. "You'll end up alone with all that money and realize you threw away something real for self-respect?" Rebecca turned back, her voice cutting through his tantrum with surgical precision.